On the morning of June 6, 1944, D-Day, German soldiers peered into the grey skies over Normandy. At first, the air hummed with a strange, almost mocking rhythm. It wasn't the deep growl of their trusted Messerschmitts, nor the sharp whistle of Stukas they themselves had once flown with pride. Instead, it was something unfamiliar. Bulky silhouettes with double fuselages, stubby wings, or glass noses that seemed almost comical to the hardened Luftwaffe veterans who spotted them. Prisoners of war, already captured in the chaos of the landings, would later laugh at what they described as flying mistakes, odd contraptions the Americans dared to call airplanes. To German eyes, trained to measure perfection in symmetry and sleekness, these machines looked like little more than industrial jokes painted with stars. But in war, appearances meant nothing when firepower and endurance decided the fate of men and nations. What the POWs did not yet realize, sitting behind barbed wire in hastily built camps across England and later the United States, was that these strange American planes they had mocked with laughter, were about to reshape the skies of Europe. They laughed at the squat, boxy Thunderbolt, calling it a milk jug with wings. They mocked the twin-boomed P-38 Lightning, saying it looked more like a barn door than a fighter. They scoffed at the B-24 Liberator, ungainly compared to their elegant Heinkels. Yet when the thunder rolled and the skies filled with the roar of hundreds of engines, laughter turned to silence. America's unusual warbirds did not need to look graceful to be deadly. They only needed to fly, fight, and return, again and again, until the Reich itself lay in ruins. In the early summer of 1944, the war had entered a phase where the skies themselves determined the fate of armies. For the German soldiers now held as prisoners of war in hastily constructed camps in southern England, the irony was thick in the air. Many of them had once served in or alongside the Luftwaffe, men who prided themselves on the technological elegance of their nation's aircraft. They remembered sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s diving gracefully with razor-like precision, the angular wings of the Focke-Wulf 190 cutting through clouds like sharpened steel, and the Stuka's terrifying wail as it fell upon its prey. To them, warplanes were not just tools of destruction. They were symbols of engineering supremacy and national pride. And so, when they first caught sight of America's aerial machines rolling over the skies of Europe or parked at makeshift Allied airstrips, their reactions were instinctive: disbelief, ridicule, and laughter. Some POWs recounted, with a smirk, the first time they saw the P-47 Thunderbolt. Compared to the slim profile of a Messerschmitt, the Thunderbolt seemed grotesque, its fuselage wide and swollen, like a barrel tipped sideways, with wings strapped awkwardly to its frame. "A flying milk can," one captured Luftwaffe sergeant muttered, shaking his head. His comrades chuckled, convinced that such ungainly machines could never stand against the finely tuned German fighters that had ruled the skies only a few years earlier. But mockery is cheap in the quiet of captivity. They were behind barbed wire, unarmed, their only weapons being memory and pride. To them, the war was already slipping away, though they dared not say it aloud. What they could not see from those cages was the truth being written above the clouds. The Thunderbolt, for all its bulk, was proving to be a machine of raw, unrelenting strength. Allied pilots joked that if you shot a P-47, you'd run out of ammunition before you brought it down. German airmen, who had once jeered at its cumbersome body, began to discover its brutal efficiency firsthand. When they returned from missions, those lucky enough to escape dogfights spoke of Thunderbolts diving like falling anvils. Their 850 caliber machine guns blazing streams of fire, powerful enough to tear wings from a Messerschmitt in a single pass. The laughter that once greeted its shape faded quickly when its shadow appeared overhead, filling the cockpits of German pilots with dread. The POWs, however, did not yet know this. For them, the most shocking sight would come later, when they saw film reels or overheard American guards recounting the victories of these flying barrels. To sit behind the wire and hear that an ungainly Thunderbolt had survived. A return from Germany riddled with holes, engines coughing yet wings still holding, was to realize that war did not reward elegance, it rewarded endurance. And then there was the P-38 Lightning. When German prisoners first laid eyes on its twin-boom design, their laughter was almost uncontrollable. One Luftwaffe mechanic captured near Caen allegedly said the plane looked like two aircraft welded together by drunken engineers. Indeed, to those raised on the idea of sleek, symmetrical beauty in flight, the Lightning's design seemed absurd. But appearances deceive. The P-38 could dive with terrifying speed, strike with cannons and machine guns mounted at its nose, and climb where others faltered. It was the Lightning that hunted high above Europe, escorting bombers deep into the Reich, and it was the Lightning that delivered silent death to many who once scoffed at it. Even Adolf Galland, Germany's famed ace, admitted privately that the P-38 was underestimated at first, until it became clear that it was one of the Allies' deadliest weapons. Prisoners would whisper stories, some true, some exaggerated, about the Lightning's feats. They heard that the same ungainly bird had ranged far across the Pacific, downing Japanese planes and proving its reach in warscapes they could scarcely imagine. They laughed less now, though some still clung to pride, dismissing these stories as Allied propaganda. Yet each time another guard walked past with a newspaper reporting German cities bombed to rubble, escorted by swarms of the very planes they had ridiculed, their silence grew heavier. The B-24 Liberator was another object of their derision. To German eyes, it was too broad, too awkward, lacking the sinister beauty of their own Heinkel or Junkers bombers. They called it clumsy, like a beast of burden forced into the skies. But when the POWs heard of its range, longer than the B-17, capable of reaching deep into the industrial heart of Germany, they began to realize the scale of America's strategy. It wasn't about grace, it was about reach, about filling the skies with so many engines and so much firepower that the Luftwaffe could no longer breathe. The Liberator's ungainly body carried with it the weight of inevitability. It was not meant to dazzle, it was meant to crush. And yet the German prisoners clung to their mockery because pride was all they had left. To admit otherwise was to accept that their Reich, once so proud, was being dismantled by machines that looked as if they should never have flown. There is a cruelty in realizing that the war you once fought with conviction is being lost not to enemies who look like gods, but to machines that seemed ridiculous until they proved unstoppable. The camps echoed with this unspoken tension. In the evenings, some POWs would draw crude sketches in the dirt of the aircraft they once flew, comparing them to the Allied machines they now saw overhead. They would laugh, but the laughter was thinner each time. The guards could see it too. The slow erosion of confidence, the realization dawning across the faces of young men who had once believed themselves invincible. The skies above were filled with strange silhouettes, and each one carried the weight of a world that was shifting beneath their feet. By the late summer of 1944, the laughter of captured Germans in Allied camps had dulled into something else, a nervous silence broken only by whispers when news trickled in. Day after day, the skies over Europe became a stage for America's so-called unusual planes, and the stories of their deeds could not be silenced even by barbed wire. Guards spoke of them, Allied newspapers carried their photographs, and overhead, prisoners could hear the endless drone of engines flying toward occupied territory. Each sound reminded them that the machines they had ridiculed were rewriting the war's script. For many POWs, the turning point came with their exposure to the relentless bombing campaigns. They had once imagined the Luftwaffe as a shield that no force could penetrate. They had been told that German industry was untouchable, that the fatherland's cities were safe behind walls of flak and fighters. Yet as they sat in the camps, they overheard the guards talking about cities like Hamburg, Cologne and Berlin reduced to rubble, the skies darkened by formations of hundreds of B-17s and B-24s. What stunned them most was not just the destruction. It was that these ungainly aircraft, dismissed as slow and clumsy, kept coming back wave after wave. No matter how many were shot down, the Germans had long celebrated their own bombers for their precision. But by 1944, they could no longer compare. American bombers flew in numbers so great that no elegant Heinkel or Junkers could match their endurance. The prisoners began to understand the philosophy behind these machines. The Americans did not build for beauty. They built for resilience and scale. Each B-24 that rumbled into the sky represented a nation that had harnessed its industrial might like no other in history. German prisoners, staring upward through the chain-link fences of their captivity, could not escape the truth. These clumsy beasts were carrying the war directly into the Reich's heart, and nothing seemed able to stop them. The guards sometimes shared stories with a mix of awe and grim satisfaction. They spoke of a Thunderbolt limping back across the channel, its fuselage torn open by cannon fire, yet still landing safely. They mentioned lightnings that had flown from bases in Britain all the way into central Germany and back, escorting bombers with a reach no German pilot thought possible. For the POWs, it was as if the world had turned upside down. The aircraft they had laughed at for their supposed impracticality were defying logic, accomplishing missions that no one believed could be done. Some prisoners clung desperately to denial. "Propaganda," they muttered, dismissing the stories as Allied exaggeration. But denial only goes so far when the evidence soars above your head. Every time an Allied formation flew past, its engines rattling the fences and sending a tremor through the earth beneath their boots, their certainty weakened. Some could not even look up anymore. Others stared in bitter silence, their eyes following the silhouettes until they disappeared into the horizon. There were also moments of dark irony. In one camp, a group of captured Luftwaffe pilots laughed openly at the sight of a P-47 parked on the airfield nearby. They jeered at its bloated shape, but a guard, hearing them, simply smiled. "That fat one," the guard told them, "brought down 3 Focke-Wulfs yesterday. 3! The laughter stopped. For the POWs, humiliation was sharper than any wound. To mock a machine, only to learn it had outmatched the pride of their own skies, was like swallowing fire. And the P-38 Lightning, the strangest of them all, carried with it an almost mythic reputation. Prisoners whispered stories of its long-range missions over Africa, Italy, and even across the vast Pacific. One captured soldier recalled hearing about Operation Vengeance, when a formation of P-38s shot down the plane of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor. Even in captivity, that story spread like wildfire, its symbolism impossible to ignore. If such a strange-looking aircraft could reach across the Pacific and strike so decisively, what could it not do over Europe? Each passing week brought more evidence that their mockery had been misplaced. Newspapers circulating among Allied troops carried photographs of German cities burning, factories smashed, bridges shattered, all consequences of raids led by the bombers and their escorts. For the men behind the wire, it was an endless reminder that the war they once fought with pride was being dismantled by machines they had dismissed as absurd. The humiliation cut deep, and though few admitted it aloud, the mocking laughter that had once echoed in the camps had now become a memory. Buried under the sound of engines in the sky, there was a psychological weight to it all. War is not only fought on battlefields, but also in the minds of men. To see your enemy's weapons mocked, only to watch them succeed spectacularly, corrodes the spirit. The German POWs felt this corrosion day by day. They had once stood with their chins high, believing their Reich had the finest machines, the best engineers, the most disciplined pilots. But now they were prisoners, staring at the strange, bulky, ungainly planes of their enemy, and realizing those planes had brought them here. It was a cruel twist of fate that the very machines they laughed at symbolized their own defeat, and in that realization, something shifted. Some POWs began to respect what they had once ridiculed. They spoke quietly of the courage it must take for American pilots to climb into such aircraft and fly into the heart of Germany day after day. Others admired the sheer force of industrial power behind it, the ability of the United States to mass-produce aircraft not just for one front, but for every theater of the war. In their quiet moments, they admitted that while German engineering built masterpieces, American industry built victory. As autumn turned to winter in 1944, the skies over Europe became the most crowded battlefield of the war. German prisoners in Allied camps, once so eager to laugh at the ungainly outlines of America's planes, now listened with a heaviness that pressed on their chests. The Allied war machine was no longer a rumor, it was a storm. The P-47s and P-38s that they had mocked flew daily, their silhouettes etched into the memories of those who watched them pass. The bombers, ungainly beasts of burden, became the harbingers of a new kind of war, one of endurance, attrition, and inevitability. For the POWs, every passing day behind the wire was a lesson in humility, a reminder of how disastrously wrong their first impressions had been. By December, the Battle of the Bulge brought a desperate counterattack from the Wehrmacht. Some prisoners, hearing the news, brightened briefly. Perhaps the tide was turning. Yet the skies told another story. When weather cleared, the Americans unleashed their aerial power in ways the prisoners could scarcely comprehend. Thunderbolts, Lightnings, and Mustangs rained destruction upon German supply lines, armored columns, and even small villages pressed into military use. POWs would later hear about entire panzer divisions stranded for lack of fuel, their tanks smoldering under the relentless attack of the very milk jugs with wings they had once ridiculed. The irony was suffocating. What use was the pride of the Reich's engineering when crude-looking American fighters could halt an entire offensive in its tracks? Some prisoners, particularly former Luftwaffe men, struggled the most. They had been raised in a culture that worshipped aviation as the pinnacle of German genius. To them, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 had been an extension of their very identity, sleek, lethal, revered. But to see their comrades defeated not by planes of equal elegance, but by ungainly, rugged machines, was almost unbearable. For some, it was easier to cling to denial, insisting that America had simply drowned them in numbers. Yet others began to sense a deeper truth, that war was not won by beauty, but by function, durability, and the will to endure losses and strike again. One German pilot, captured after bailing out near Normandy, confessed this realization in the camp. He had seen a Thunderbolt survive hits that would have reduced a Bf 109 to ashes. He admitted with bitter respect that the Americans had built aircraft like tanks, machines designed not for elegance, but for survival. Our planes were like swords, he said quietly. Theirs were like hammers. And in this war the hammer won. His words spread through the camp, carried in hushed tones, each retelling chipping away at the arrogance that had once filled those fences with laughter. The POWs also began to notice something else, the demeanor of the American pilots. Whenever the guards spoke of their comrades in the skies, there was a mix of affection and awe. They described pilots returning with aircraft scarred and broken, yet climbing back into the cockpit the next day. To the prisoners, this resilience was alien. They had been taught that German superiority would always carry the day, that their machines were unmatched. But what they saw in their captors was not superiority in design, but relentlessness in spirit and production. America could lose planes and pilots and still send more, day after day, until resistance crumbled. It was a scale of war that Germany simply could not match. By the spring of 1945, the prisoners no longer mocked the strange outlines of American planes. They could not. For by then, they had heard that Berlin itself lay in ruins, the Reichstag burning, the once proud Luftwaffe reduced to a shadow of its former self. The skies they had once claimed as their domain now belonged entirely to the Allies. They knew the names of the planes by heart, Thunderbolt, Lightning, Liberator, not as jokes, but as symbols of inevitability. The war had taught them a brutal lesson. Appearances deceive, but results do not. When Germany finally surrendered in May, many POWs felt an ache that went deeper than defeat. It was not only the loss of their nation's cause, it was the humiliation of knowing that they had laughed at the very weapons that had brought them to their knees. In later years, some would admit in interviews or memoirs that they had misjudged the Americans. They recalled the odd shapes of the planes with a kind of reluctant reverence. Some even smiled at the memory of their own arrogance, remembering how they once scoffed at the Thunderbolt as a flying milk can, only to later realize it had been one of the deadliest fighters of the war. The legacy of those unusual planes lingered long after the war ended. For many former prisoners, they became symbols of a truth too easily forgotten, that strength does not always wear the cloak of beauty, that victory is often carried not by perfection, but by persistence. The laughter that once echoed in the prison yards was replaced in memory by the roar of engines, the sound of strange, awkward machines that conquered not through elegance, but through unyielding power. And so the story of German POWs mocking America's planes is more than an anecdote of wartime arrogance. It is a mirror reflecting how pride can blind men to reality and how war humbles even the most confident. Those ungainly aircraft, marked, jeered, and dismissed, became legends, not for how they looked but for what they did. To the POWs who once laughed at them, they became the sound of defeat. To the world, they became the wings of victory.